The citation arrived 4 days after the season's first major snowstorm, describing a $200 fine for excessive and unauthorized snow removal extending onto HOA common area, a charge that genuinely confused me, since I had spent the entirety of that storm's aftermath doing nothing more than clearing my own driveway and front walkway. Work I hired out to a snow removal service every single winter, and had absolutely no reason to believe had extended anywhere beyond my own property line. My name is Bartholomew Echtterberg-Nkemelu. I live in Ridgemont Pines, a community of about 200 homes in a region that gets genuinely serious winter weather, and I want to establish clearly, because it matters enormously for everything that follows, that I contract the exact same snow removal company every winter, a reliable local operation run by a man named Desmond Ferrer Boyd, who clears my driveway and walkway on a standing seasonal contract, work that has never once, in the 4 years I've used his service, extended beyond the clearly marked boundaries of my own property. The woman who issued the citation was Priscilla Wentworth Ashcombe, president of our HOA board for about a year and a half at that point. I want to walk you through her tenure leading up to this incident, because it followed a pattern I've since come to understand is fairly common in these situations: an aggressive, unilateral enforcement style that had already generated real frustration among several neighbors before this particular dispute ever reached me directly. Citations over minor landscaping variations, holiday decoration timing, disputes that, individually, most residents had simply absorbed as ordinary. If irritating, HOA overreach rather than something worth formally fighting. I want to tell you about the specific language of the citation, because it described the alleged violation with a level of confident detail that genuinely puzzled me given how certain I was that nothing like what it described had actually occurred. It stated that snow had been cleared from my property in a manner that deposited excessive accumulated snow onto the adjacent common area walking path, creating what Priscilla characterized as a hazardous obstruction that the HOA's own maintenance crew had needed to clear at additional cost. The citation stated I would be responsible for reimbursing in addition to the base fine. I want to walk you through the conversation I had with Priscilla directly after receiving that citation, because I explained, as clearly as I could, that my snow removal service operates entirely within my own property boundaries, using equipment specifically calibrated to avoid pushing snow onto adjacent common areas precisely because Desmond, my contractor, had told me years earlier that this was standard practice for any reputable service operating in an HOA community with shared walking paths. Priscilla's response was that the HOA's maintenance supervisor had personally observed and documented the violation, and that the citation would stand unless I could provide evidence disputing his account. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, personally observed and documented, because it struck me, even in that first conversation, as an unusually confident claim for something I was quite certain had never actually happened. I asked whether any photographic documentation existed, and Priscilla stated that the maintenance supervisor's written report describing the observed violation constituted sufficient documentation under the association's enforcement procedures, and that photographic evidence, while sometimes collected, was not strictly required for a citation to be considered valid. I want to walk you through the decision I made at that point, because I think it matters for understanding how this situation ultimately resolved in my favor. Rather than simply arguing my case verbally against an unsubstantiated written report, I decided to gather my own independent evidence, and I want to tell you about the specific piece of good fortune that made this possible, because it turned out to matter enormously. About 8 months before this incident, following a minor package theft that had affected several households on my street, I had installed a home security camera system, including one unit positioned to cover my full driveway and the adjacent stretch of walking path, where the alleged violation supposedly occurred, a detail I hadn't initially thought much about in the context of this specific dispute. Since my primary concern when installing it had been package security, rather than any anticipated need to document snow removal practices. I want to tell you about pulling that footage, because the specific date and time frame described in Priscilla's citation, correlating to when Desmond's crew had cleared my driveway following the storm, was still well within my camera system's storage retention window, meaning I had complete, time-stamped video coverage of the exact snow removal work in question. What that footage showed, once I reviewed it carefully, was Desmond's crew performing exactly the kind of careful, boundary-respecting snow removal I had always assumed occurred, clearing my driveway and walkway using equipment that pushed accumulated snow into a designated pile, entirely within my own property line, with no snow whatsoever extending onto the adjacent common area walking path at any point during the entire recorded session. I want to walk you through the moment I realized this discrepancy meant something more than a simple mistaken observation, because the footage didn't just fail to show the alleged violation. It showed, clearly and unambiguously, that no accumulation of snow had ever existed on that section of common area path at all during, or immediately after my property's snow removal, meaning the maintenance supervisor's written report describing a personally observed and documented hazardous obstruction could not have accurately described what my own camera had captured happening at that exact location during that exact time frame. I want to introduce you to my neighbor, Rosalind Kowalska-Ferreira, who mentioned to me, once I described what I'd found in my footage, that she had received an oddly similar citation the previous winter, also alleging excessive snow deposit onto common area from her own driveway clearing, a citation she had simply paid at the time rather than fight, assuming, as I nearly had myself, that the HOA's account must have some accurate basis she simply hadn't witnessed herself. That conversation, and the possibility that my own footage-backed challenge to this citation might reveal something considerably broader than a single mistaken report, is where Part 2 picks up. Because what I discovered once I started asking more residents about their own snow-related citations over the preceding 2 winters revealed a pattern that went well beyond my own individual case, and led directly to Priscilla Wentworth Ashcombe's entire winter enforcement record being formally and publicly reviewed. Rosalind's mention of her own similar citation sent me asking around the neighborhood over the following 2 weeks, and what I found, once I'd spoken with about a dozen households, revealed a pattern considerably broader than either of us initially expected. 7 different residents, across the preceding 2 winter seasons, had received nearly identically worded citations alleging excessive snow deposit onto common area walking paths, every single one citing the same maintenance supervisor's personally observed and documented report as the basis for the fine, and every single one, once I asked specifically, had simply paid the $200 fine rather than fight it. None of them having had the specific advantage I did of independent security, camera footage, directly contradicting the alleged violation. I want to walk you through the moment this pattern crystallized into something considerably more serious than simple enforcement carelessness, because it happened once I actually pulled the total dollar figure involved. 7 prior citations, plus my own, at $200 each, came to just over $1,600 collected specifically under this particular excessive snow clearing violation category over 2 winter seasons, a modest but not insignificant sum that, once I started digging into how these fine collections were actually processed within the HOA's own financial records, revealed something that mattered enormously for understanding why this pattern had developed in the first place. I want to introduce you to a former HOA board member, a man named Farrokh Delacroix-Conquo, who had served during part of Priscilla's tenure before resigning about a year earlier over what he described to me, Once I reached out asking about historical snow citation practices, as general discomfort with how aggressively fines were being pursued relative to actual documented violations. Farrokh told me something that reframed my entire understanding of what had actually been happening. Bartholomew, he said, I want you to understand something about how our HOA's fine structure worked during that period. A portion of collected fine revenue, under a policy Priscilla herself had pushed through early in her tenure, went toward a discretionary maintenance supervisor incentive fund, intended, at least on paper, to reward proactive violation reporting that helped the association avoid larger maintenance costs down the line. I raised concerns at the time that this created an obvious incentive problem, a maintenance supervisor financially benefiting from documenting more violations, regardless of whether those violations were genuinely occurring. But I was overruled, and I ultimately decided it wasn't a fight I wanted to keep having, which I'll admit, looking back, probably wasn't the right call given what you're now describing. I want to sit with what this actually meant, because it provided a clear, concrete motive for exactly the pattern Rosalind and I had started to uncover. The maintenance supervisor, whose compensation was apparently directly tied, at least in part, to a fund fed by collected violation fines, had a genuine financial incentive to document violations, whether or not they had actually, accurately occurred, and my own security footage, directly contradicting his personally observed and documented report in my specific case, suggested strongly that at least some portion of these 7 prior citations may have been similarly fabricated or exaggerated. I contacted an attorney, a woman named Adiz Nwasu Ferreira, who specialized in HOA governance and fee assessment disputes, and brought her my security footage, Farrokh's account of the Maintenance Supervisor Incentive Fund, and the pattern of 7 prior similar citations I'd identified. Adiz reviewed everything and told me within our first meeting that this represented a genuinely serious governance problem well beyond my own individual fine dispute. This is a textbook example of exactly the kind of structural incentive problem that HOA fee assessment processes are supposed to guard against, she told me. A maintenance supervisor with a direct financial stake in generating violation citations, combined with an enforcement process that, by your board president's own admission, doesn't require photographic documentation before a fine is issued, creates an environment genuinely ripe for exactly this kind of pattern, whether it originated from deliberate fabrication or simply a strong, unconscious incentive to interpret ambiguous situations in whatever direction generated more citations. Adiz helped me formally request a full accounting of the Maintenance Supervisor Incentive Fund's payment history, along with the underlying documentation for all 7 prior snow-related citations, a records request that, under our state's HOA transparency requirements, the association was obligated to fulfill. What that request revealed, once the records finally came back, showed that the maintenance supervisor's compensation from the incentive fund had increased notably during exactly the 2 winter seasons when these 7 citations were issued, a correlation that, while not conclusive proof of deliberate fabrication on its own, added considerably to the overall picture Adiz and I were building. I want to walk you through the community meeting we eventually requested, because it was the first time the broader membership learned about both the Maintenance Supervisor Incentive Fund's existence and my own footage directly contradicting a supposedly, personally observed and documented, violation report. I presented my security camera footage alongside the citation-specific claims, showing the room, side by side, exactly what the maintenance supervisor's report alleged versus what my camera had actually recorded during the identical timeframe, a discrepancy that generated the kind of stunned, murmuring reaction I'd heard described by friends dealing with similar HOA documentation disputes. Rosalind and several of the other affected residents spoke as well, describing their own citations and their decision at the time to simply pay rather than fight, an admission that, once combined with my own hard video evidence, painted a picture of a pattern considerably more troubling than any single mistaken report could explain on its own. Priscilla, given the opportunity to respond, attempted initially to defend both the incentive fund's legitimacy and the maintenance supervisor's overall reporting record, an explanation that fell apart considerably once a resident near the front asked directly whether the board had ever required photographic documentation for any citation issued under this program, a question Priscilla could not answer affirmatively, confirming, in front of the full room, exactly the documentation gap that had allowed this pattern to persist unchecked for 2 full winter seasons. The vote that followed authorized an immediate suspension of the Maintenance Supervisor Incentive Fund pending full review, a formal requirement that all future violation citations include photographic or video documentation before any fine could be assessed, full refunds for all 7 previously issued snow-related citations, given the demonstrated pattern of unreliable documentation, and removal of Priscilla from the board, given her role in establishing and defending the flawed incentive structure that had made this entire pattern possible in the first place. I want to tell you about the maintenance supervisor's own situation, because the HOA's subsequent internal review, once conducted properly, found insufficient evidence to definitively prove deliberate fabrication in any single case, though the review did conclude that the incentive fund had created exactly the kind of documentation carelessness Adiz had predicted, resulting in his position being restructured entirely, moving to a standard fixed compensation model with no fine-based incentive component whatsoever going forward. I want to tell you about the refund check that arrived a few weeks later, because it wasn't really about the $200 for me personally, though I understand it meant considerably more to a few of the other affected families, given how the accumulated fines had added up across their own individual disputes. What mattered more to me was watching Ridgemont Pines adopt a documentation standard that meant no future resident would ever again face a citation based on nothing more than an unverified written claim from someone with a direct financial stake in generating more of them. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Adiz said to me during one of our early meetings, reviewing my security footage alongside the citation's confident, unsubstantiated language for what felt like the 5th time. She said that enforcement systems built around financial incentives for the enforcer, rather than neutral, evidence-based review, create exactly the kind of structural pressure that can corrupt even reasonably well-intentioned people over time, and that the moment someone actually demands hard evidence rather than accepting a confident written claim at face value, that entire fragile structure tends to reveal itself considerably faster than anyone benefiting from it ever expects. We demanded the evidence, and it turns out that one home security camera installed for an entirely unrelated reason, one former board member willing to explain exactly how the incentive fund actually worked, and one clear, time-stamped video showing precisely what did not happen, were more than enough to prove that Priscilla Wentworth Ashcombe's confident snow removal citation had never had anything real behind it at all. Thumbnail text. My camera proved her report was false.